And now I ask Kavindya. Kavindya, please.
Yeah, I'm just going to switch on my time as well, just to make sure I don't go over time. I'm just going to share my screen simply because I'm a little visual and it's hard for me to say things without showing them. So I hope you humor me with my pictures. Um, so what I wanted to focus on, just to give you a bit about kind of where I'm coming into this topic from. My background is I work in education technology for years, and during my time in Sri Lanka, I mainly worked with local schools. So trying to understand how creativity and critical thinking can be taken into local curriculums and local schools, and understanding how tech-enabled learning can work in schools that are off the grid, in schools that have barely 2G or barely 2G internet. Um, I wanted to start off with this. I know it was circulating around Twitter and social media, and it was interesting to me that people were surprised by this because this has been the reality of local classrooms, especially I was born and raised in Dilani, and we still don't have 3G. We still have barely bare amounts of 2G connectivity across these areas. So this is a reality. And what COVID simply did was kind of bring it to the limelight and show that there were massive disparities in the quality of access. Because earlier when we talked about access, we simply said if a child is in school, we just ticked the box and said, all right, we've met access to quality education. But what COVID showed was there are these glaring disparities in the quality of that access. So keeping in mind that this is the reality we're thinking about, this is sort of how I wanted to structure the next 15 minutes. First, I wanted to do a quick dive into the report, but just focusing on their focus on technology and skills. And then to really take a step back and say, where are we trying to go? What does the end look like? What does success mean in terms of how the report has been structured and what success ideally should mean to us? And thirdly, to understand how we might get there. What kind of approaches and mindsets will help us get there? And fourthly, I have a very interesting case study that I wanted to show you of what tech-enabled education could actually mean and look like. So if you take an overview of the report, because I was tasked with touching on the technology bits of it, I broke this down into three parts. So the report touches on broadly three things. So first, it talks a little bit about around systems. So how might we create systems that are tech-enabled? So here the focus is really on two things. The report suggests an integrated learning management system, which can work very well, because if you look at how the zonal education and the provincial education systems are structured, information is lost, information is not passed down, and then this is a good move. And the second focus is really on rethinking what success means like in the school system, and trying to streamline some of those key performances. And I totally agree with what Professor Parakrama said in terms of this has a very consultancy World Bank feel to this report. It's almost like a consulting company came up with it, which I think is evident from kind of the professions or spaces that the people who wrote this came from. And then the second portion that touches on technology is the learning portion in terms of students. So here there are two things that stood out for me: this idea of a flipped classroom, and trying to understand how learning within a classroom can change. And just to take a step back, my focus through this presentation will mostly be around K through 12 schools, simply because that's where I have worked. And the second portion in terms of learning is around how we might integrate ourselves into learning platforms. So using content from spaces like Coursera and Udemy. And it's interesting, I was previously a Coursera employee for transparency. So Coursera's largest number of users from the Commonwealth, the largest number of new users actually comes from Sri Lanka. and the highest kind of searched courses are in communications and data science. So you really have university students and young people approaching platforms like Coursera and Udemy, and this inclination towards self-learning. And some of those numbers were shared with the ministry, and I'm not sure what happened afterwards, but I know those numbers are shared. So the third portion of the technology piece of this report is around learning for teachers. And this is something that's interesting because if you speak to local school teachers and the local school teachers that I've worked with, this constant struggle is around seminar එකකට යන්න තියෙනවා. හෙට seminar එකක් තියෙනවා. පැය 3ක seminar එකක් තියෙනවා. workshop එකක් තියෙනවා. ඉඳගෙන තමයි ඉන්න තියෙන්නේ. So the way we approach teacher training, generally, there are obviously pockets of innovation, but generally how we approach teacher training has not evolved for many years. And I think this idea of how do we streamline some of these pathways for somebody to become a teacher is something exciting and interesting to look at. But obviously, I agree with what Dr. said and also what Professor Parakrama said, that the how it's going to happen is really missing. Let me skip through this. And the next portion I wanted to move on to was, what does that future look like? So we have reports, but with most governments, reports simply remain PDFs. And it's nice to have that, citations in research journals, and it doesn't lead to anything. So when we look at outcomes, there was this focus on 21st century skills. And it's interesting that we're really late to the party because we've been talking about 21st century skills for many years, and the education sector has been talking about 21st century skills for many years. So briefly, in terms of this future that at least the report is looking to, and what education systems around the world have started looking into at least about 4 years ago, has been this idea of 21st century skills. And this again tries to achieve this idea of employability. And this is obviously divided into 3 parts. You have your foundational literacies, you have your competencies and character qualities. And this came from the World Economic Forum. And I'm sure many people in this audience who are from the education sector would have seen this. And the interesting thing is, increasingly, this portion of character qualities that got coined in about, I think, 2016 or 17, is what shifted into what we talk about as social emotional learning today. And this is something that's briefly touched on the report, but again, because there is a lack of people who are educators in terms of the people who created it, there's not an intentional inclusion of how social emotional learning will be taught. So this is kind of the general overview of what social emotional learning is considered to be, especially within research communities and also the development sector. So we look at these big 5 domains of social emotional learning. You have this idea of task performance. These are higher order skills. And then you have ideas of emotional regulation, which really feeds into early childhood education, things like emotional control, stress resistance. Then the third bucket here is collaboration. So this is where you have things like empathy, trust, cooperating, working together as a team. And then open-mindedness and engaging with others. But increasingly, especially in the research community in the cell space, which is where I come from, our focus has been what we call metacognition. And metacognition is kind of considered to be that base skill that helps achieve all of these other kind of big 5 domains. And simply put, metacognition is giving children and young learners the ability to think about their thinking. So it's not about giving them ICT skills or teaching them math or teaching them science. It's really about giving them the needed mindsets and frameworks to help them think about their thinking, or in other words, to learn about their learning. So this is a huge shift. And I think in terms of that future that we're looking at, it's really important to understand what will that look like after they pass through this, because reimagination has been kind of the cornerstone of how we talk about education for the past, I think, 2 years. And reimagination, I think, is a very political term, which is what it should be. But I think we're using this term without really understanding that reimagination means that we're breaking away from the system of how it has worked. So I think in reimagination, we really need to understand, what does success mean to us? What does success look like for us? What does a learner leaving this system look like at the end of the day? And I will obviously share this presentation with you afterwards. But this is a really interesting framing of 7 types of learners that that an ideal education system or a classroom should release. So it goes from an empowered learner, a digital citizen, somebody who not only consumes knowledge but constructs knowledge. And design is heavy, so an innovative designer who is redesigning their spaces, their systems, their lives. A computational thinker, so someone who goes beyond becoming just somebody who knows coding to being somebody who thinks about the world around them in a way using computational skills. A creative communicator, and a global collaborator. So these are some of these learner archetypes that ideal education systems, schools, and classrooms kind of aspire to reach. Then the third portion that I wanted to run through was, how can we get there? If this is the future we envision, what kind of approaches might help us get there, which is some of those gaps that we're missing. I think somebody is unmuted. Okay, perfect. My sound is clear, right?
You're good. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, cool. Awesome. So with approaches or how we get to that end, I wanted to kind of float these 3 ideas with you that we follow in the instructional design space. So one is systems thinking, and this idea that we can't sit in an air-conditioned room and reimagine education, because there are so many of these moving pieces, and whatever we put in place needs to be learn and educator first. So adopting this systems thinking approach. When we talk about tech-enabled learning, we always say 5 groups need to come together. One is telcos, to make sure everybody has access and the devices that they need. The state apparatus, to make sure the systems are in place to deliver what these tech-enabled learning looks like. Educators and learners who bring in kind of the subject matter expertise. Technologists who are setting up the mediums through which the learning is delivered, and instructional designers who are then creating that learning experience. So we always say it's not enough for just the technologists to be in the room or the telcos to be in the room. All these 4 groups of people need to come together if tech-enabled learning has to work. And the third idea I wanted to float about in terms of approaches is the idea of backward design. Which is something that we use as designers when we create learning tools and experiences, where we always start from the end success picture or the end result. So we first try to identify what are the desired results. Then we try to identify, all right, how do we understand that these desired results have been met? How do we understand that success has been achieved? And then we go about creating that learning experience that will help us get to those end results. So I think at least in Sri Lanka, when we create curriculums, we always start with learning outcomes, and then we immediately go into creating the textbooks or the examination papers and things like that. So this idea of how might we design this backward. And this is kind of advocating for my discipline, but to say that we need instructional and learning experience designers coming in to create this, because education as we know it has dramatically changed, and we need people who have the experience, who will bring a deep understanding of how learning happens, from neurology to cognitive psychology to philosophy, then designers who are bringing design principles, and also educators together if the learning experience is to work. What I wanted to leave you with was technology is just the medium. It's not the learning. The learning is an experience that we design and create. Technology is simply what is used to transport that from point A to point B. And I think what we've missed out during COVID is assuming that technology is education. Technology is not education. Technology is simply a medium, but we need to design the learning to suit that medium that helps us take it from point A to point B. And the last thing I wanted to leave you with, I know I'm 6 seconds over time, but the MIT Media Lab's governance lab recently released a report of a pilot that they ran where they used WhatsApp for a civic curriculum. So an entirely remote distance learning civic curriculum that was distributed in South Africa that entirely ran on WhatsApp. So these are some screenshots of how they did it, utilizing functions, some of the voice note functions, replying all. So there was no Zoom, no Google Classrooms. It entirely ran on WhatsApp. So I think this is what I wanted to highlight. The technology is just the medium, but it's how we create the learning experience to help us get to the end. If I'm more than happy to share this deck with anybody interested. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Kavindya. Yes.